My name is Antony. I am currently head of development for IS Liquid Metrics. Previously, I was a technical director at a digital agency. Currently, also a Git-Kraken ambassador. I'm a certified Scrum Master. I have a certification in Agile Leadership. I've been working with Umbraco CMS for the last 13 years, so I'm an Umbraco MVP and also an Umbraco Master. So, ring fence the chaos. What motivated this talk? So, I've worked in a bunch of organizations in various levels, and over the course of my career, I've consulted different companies, all different sizes. And I'm really interested in development and organizational processes and what causes bottlenecks. And as part of this, I've learned a lot about team structures, team communication, different project management methodologies and when they're applicable. And I'm interested in efficiencies, and I've worked in a lot of chaotic environments as well. So all of this is kind of culminated in this one presentation. So before I start, audience, how many of you are working in some sort of agency? A few people. And how many people are working in a company of over 100? I can't see everyone, but I'm just going to assume that some of you are. And I assume you all have some sort of technological background because you're all CTOs, and won't bother about that question. So I want to start with a story of a company that I worked for many, many years ago. This was a company that was not very agile. They were very document heavy. This was back when Clippy was still actually a thing. I was contracted to build an Umbraco website. Pretty straightforward. Umbraco has a SQL database because that's just the way Umbraco is built. When I asked about the SQL database provisioning, I was told by the lead developer, you have to call IT, or you have to provision this via IT, which was fine. Large organizations have IT departments. So the process was basically like this. I sent an email to the lead developer. Then he made a request to the project manager, which was interesting. Don't know why that was required. Of course, the project manager said no. So this was quite weird. But eventually, the project manager said, okay, fine. And then that went to finance, which was totally strange for me. Why would the database go to finance? And of course, finance said no, because that's an extra cost to the project. Even though it's an Umbraco website, which requires SQL database. Eventually they said, fine, this will be an extra cost to the project. And then a quote was raised to the IT department. This is when I started thinking, this is an organization that's structured in a bit of a weird way. It turned out that the organization had an IT department, which was basically a different tax entity. So they was structured in a way to kind of be a bit more tax efficient, let's say. Eventually, we had to request a booking. And 2 weeks later, you would think that the database was created, but turns out the person that was meant to create the database called in sick. So after going back and requesting another booking, and probably a week later, the database was actually created. So just want to show everyone what creating a database looks like. Right click, new database, give it a name. And there's your new database. So all of that took about 2 weeks. So what are some observations about this organization? Firstly, there were a lot of hierarchical approval gates. Finance needed to get involved in everything for unknown reasons. Heavy documentation, but the documentation wasn't good enough and wasn't serving its purpose. A lot of inter-department dependencies and waiting for people. So all of this was basically causing a lot of bottlenecks at each stage. So how do you know if you are a bottleneck in your organization? You may be thinking that you're really fast, but it may be that the perception externally is that you're not delivering as fast as you should. So the average time it takes to complete a task is important, but it may not be the best measure. So in the case of creating a database, we saw it only took a few minutes, but the end result, end to end, to deliver that that bit of value was actually about 2 or 3 weeks. So the time it takes from when you agree to do the work until you actually deliver it is the perception of the bottleneck. It's not how fast you actually do the work. One thing that you can do to work out if you're a bottleneck for other parts of the organization or other teams is you could just ask, are we delivering fast enough so that your team can be efficient? And you'd be surprised. The answer is normally no. And then you need to figure out why. So I'm going to talk about processes and policies that can affect your delivery, some utilization and output flow, and also a little bit about staff and skill shortages. But the last one is less less problematic. So another story. I consulted for a company once where they needed to have a Wi-Fi router installed. This was the marketing department. And of course, the IT department said no, because Wi-Fi devices were less secure than cabled ones, which is fine. But do you know what the marketing department ended up doing? They ended up going out buying a Wi-Fi router and just installing it themselves. So this totally defeated the purpose of these IT policies. So policies in an organization have valid reasons, but you need to figure out whether those policies slow people down. You can have really stringent IT policies, and I've worked in companies that are super efficient at applying these, even having a help desk where you might use Jira, for instance, to get some stuff done, opposed to talking directly to people. That can be done very, very quickly if you have the right processes in place. But the processes need to be fit for purpose. And what I mean by that is it needs to provide business value. It can't be processed for the sake of process, even if you have those valid reasons. And if you have a process which people hate, find it too slow, and can easily subvert to get what they need done, then the processes really are not fit for purpose and they don't really serve the business much value. So I'm going to talk a little bit about starting versus delivery. So very often in an organization, especially in agencies where we're dealing with clients, we're more focused on starting work rather than finishing it. And there's a little bit of subtlety in here, which I'll get to in a moment. So here are some faceless people up the top. We'll call them resources. And here are some project managers or stakeholders that need some stuff done. So in this workflow, you have one resource per set of project managers. Now, what happens when one person calls in sick or is away on vacation or is just blocked in some way? Well, 20% of your team or organization's throughput is just killed. And you get some unhappy project managers or clients or stakeholders. if you're going to organize your flow in a different way, you could do it like this, where you have 3 resources that can do any work, and the first one available will just do the work. So the glory of this is if one person is suddenly unavailable for any reason, the work still goes. You won't get a situation where 20% of your throughput is just killed. I mean, yes, you will have some slowdown, but everyone will accept the slowdown. You won't have immediately killed work. When it comes to resourcing, I've found this often in agencies. You get situations where projects steal from other teams. And what you're really doing there is you're sacrificing the efficiency of one team so that you could benefit another, which totally makes sense from a top-down management perspective, because one project may have a higher priority or maybe more critical. You maybe have a client which is more valuable to the company. But what you're really doing is you're causing bottlenecks, and what you're also doing is that individual that you move to another project is now a skill bottleneck and is actually a silo. So what happens if that person calls in sick? Well, then you have 2 projects that you've slowed down. So when it comes to team configuration, you really need to think about the types of skills that you need and have enough of those skill sets available. So in the case of teams that you have experts in, experts are really great. You can get a lot of stuff done with experts. You need experts in architecture. They're great at doing optimizations, and they can be really, really beneficial. But what you end up having if you only have a team full of experts is you have silos of one, and you have multiple points of failure. So if you have an expert in DevOps and that DevOps person is on vacation, well, that person is a silo of one, and then you have to wait. And maybe no one else can actually do that job because everyone is an expert at their own thing. So the SQL person only does SQL, the backend person only does backend, no one else does DevOps, and that's quite problematic. On the flip side, I found that when you have generalists, you can actually cause a lot of entropy in your code base and in your projects. Generalists tend to be good at maintenance because maintenance tends not to require experts unless there's something quite critical, like a massive performance problem that comes up. But yeah, generalists tend to be yielding suboptimal results and won't have the expertise of doing something complex. And they'll do the work, but over time you end up accumulating more code debt, and you end up with different types of problems. So my preference is to hire generalists that have specializations. Generalists that have specializations can all help each other, just like generalists do. They have some specialized skills so that you can do some bits really well. This reduces the single points of failure, but you will need an expert from time to time. So in my previous company, we're having some stability issues with a website, and we all were quite good at figuring out what the issues were, except for this one issue. And we really needed to bring an expert in just to fix this one issue. It turned out to be a configuration problem that we weren't aware of. But yeah, you still need experts. But in my opinion, a team full of experts is probably suboptimal. So when you're developing projects and doing work, you really need to think about what type of service you're providing, whether it's internal or external. Typically in an organization, you'll have things like projects, support maintenance, emergencies, some consultancy, and you can also have all of the above. If you ever worked in an agency, you basically have all of the above at the same time. So it's basically throwing everything inside the kitchen sink and seeing which one gets cleaned first. So here are those different types of service again. This is an example of a developer with a scheduling system. They get booked to do the work. You can't book emergencies, so we'll take that one out of the equation. Now, what typically happens in agencies is you get that person shuffled around with all the different types of work, and that can be really inefficient, because if you're relying on booking all the time, then what happens when you forget to book a deploy? Because everything needs a booking, right? So I've had a situation where I've looked at code repos, and there were pull requests that were 6-8 months old, but there were hundreds and hundreds of commits after that. So what can you actually do to this pull request if it's 8 months old? You can't do anything really. I mean, the work was done, but there were so many commits afterwards. The only thing you can really do is delete the branch. So you end up just throwing away money. And I've seen this a lot in companies that use booking. There's always something that you forget to book. Now, I want to talk about the challenges that I had in my previous company, trying to break that dependency on this booking system. A couple months ago, I'm sure everyone was aware that it was very hard to find toilet paper in the supermarket. This is basically obviously because people thought that there would be a shortage of toilet paper, so they bought toilet paper, and then it was a self-fulfilling prophecy. So people caused the problem that they thought was going to happen, and this is quite common in booking systems as well. So the project manager will get a brief in. They understand that they need X number of people, so they book them before the project is signed off. But then what they've actually done is they've caused other project managers to think, maybe I should book as well. And then they end up causing this problem that they're trying to mitigate. And then you get this rolling problem of not having any available developers or designers or QA people. And this is a very, very hard habit to break, because people rightfully want their projects to succeed. But the problem is the system was the problem, not really the habit. So you can't break the habit if the system is still there. And the thing is, a system can be a very safe place for people. If people understand and they know the system, they're familiar with it, they rely on it. And trying to get them to not use the system or not use it in the way that they have been using is quite difficult. At my previous company, what we tried to do was make it a little bit easier for people to get used to the new workflow. So we wanted to have a situation where you didn't book individual people, because we didn't know if those people would be available, because a project goes overtime, people are on vacation, people call in sick. So it didn't make sense to book individual people. We wanted a situation where you book time for a skill set, and that skill set would be filled in at some point when we know who is available. That made sense for us, but for external project managers, they were feeling that they were losing control, because they were so used to the system telling them who they're going to get. And then when it came time for the project, they would, if that person wasn't available, they would say, no, I want that person because I know that person is going to be good for my project. So they felt that they were losing control over who they were having. They didn't know what the quality was going to be like, or the reliability, and they just didn't have the relationships with all the people. I mean, they had their favorites, let's say. So when we introduced this way of working, we lost a little bit of trust. I mean, we had aspirations of making things better, and the external project managers knew that we wanted to make things better for them, but they just didn't believe that the way that we were doing things was good for them. So there were definitely some challenges, and and in hindsight, what I really wish we did was bring them in and explain more about why it's going to benefit them, and get their buy-in about the proposal, and to handhold them a little bit more, to reassure them that what we're actually doing is going to be good for them and good for the projects. So it definitely ruffled a lot of feathers. If anyone is interested, this is called a silky chicken. When I was Googling ruffled feathers, this was one of the first things that popped up. So we tried to change the way people were using the system, which was totally impossible. People had habits. We tried to get them to adopt a different mentality about how the system should be working and how the workflow should be working end to end. But that wasn't really working either because of people's habits. So in the end, we just had to abandon the system altogether, which was quite abrupt. It's definitely not something that I would prefer to do, because the larger the change, the more disruptive it can be for people. People get confused, and in our case, people did get confused because we have different types of services in our department servicing the rest of the organization. So it was confusing for external PMs. Speaking of project management, in organizations, you tend to have this this staged maturity. This is a very simplistic model. It's not necessarily the best, but it's just an idea of how organizations evolve. In the beginning, everything is quite ad hoc and a bit chaotic. Then you build up some rules, so you get to this next stage, and you get some rigorous rules even, and then you get a relaxation of those rules in the next phases, and then a really great team will seem like they are organized chaos, but they get things done really efficiently, and that's the sign of a very mature organization or team. They have the rules there, but they don't necessarily follow them because they favor communication over a rigorous process. So in terms of methodologies, Waterfall is obviously the hated methodology of developers, because everything is really prescriptive. You go from scoping, design, build, testing, but what tends to happen is the scoping phase, like the upfront phases, tend to be so drawn out that the build time ends up being really small, or the information that was gathered in those earlier phases, because it took so long, they're no longer valid. So then you end up having to go back and reiterate over those things. The thing about Waterfall is you can't always avoid it. You might have a stakeholder that just needs to work in Waterfall, and what's very common is government projects. So the governments typically won't want to work in any type of agile. They'll need things to be quite prescriptive, and rightfully so. They need some reassurances that things are going to happen. Unfortunately, government projects tend to go longer than most projects. There are some ways to introduce some agile principles into Waterfall, though. So you may have a situation where you must work in Waterfall, but what you can do is you can slip in some approval meetings or some check-in meetings. So you can say, okay, well, every month we just want to have a check-in meeting with you to show you what we're doing, so that we can make sure that you're still trusting us, that we're delivering what you want. And many clients will be quite receptive to that, even though they wanted all of those specs up front. When you present them the work, obviously they'll give you an opinion, and they'll say, oh, maybe you can do this differently. Well, that's getting a feedback loop going, and that's an agile principle. You may get a situation where clients just won't want to do it. In that case, it's quite difficult. You might have to do something like having maybe a different person in the client's organization or a different, or someone to stand in as a stakeholder, or even an internal person that tries to understand the motivations of your client and try to preempt some discussions during the process. So that's an interesting exercise. So when it comes to how agile your team is, it really depends on how mature they are. And what I mean is how long they've been working together and how well they work together. A mature team will tend to want to deploy quite rapidly, whereas an immature team that's just getting used to agile processes will need some rigorous some frameworks in there, and we'll have release cycles of maybe every 2 weeks or every month. Another big issue when it comes to agility is the leadership really affects your ability to be agile. When it comes to leaders, especially tech leaders, we really need to understand that tech teams need to be self-organizing so that they can be efficient. If we are being micromanagey and having a top-down centralized leadership style, then what we're actually doing is causing a bottleneck. So we are now a bottleneck of one. If everything needs to be approved by me, then I'm a bottleneck. So decentralizing decisions and allowing your team to make their own choices about how they need to succeed is actually quite important. And I can't stress this enough. Organizations that have top-down leadership really need to try to decentralize some of those decisions so that they can act quicker. Otherwise, you do cause that bottleneck. So when it comes to teams and learning how to be agile, when they go from an immature state to get to be learning agile, I'm Scrum certified, so I'm biased, but you need some sort of framework. You need some rules. The great thing about Scrum is you have this idea of some set meetings, and the meetings have a goal, and then everything else can be left up for interpretation. So you'll have a sprint planning meeting, you'll have your daily Scrum, you'll have a sprint review and the sprint retrospective, and that's basically it. There are rules around what these meetings can and can't discuss, but everything else is totally flexible, and it allows the team to decide on what they need to discuss and do. So as I said, mature teams will want to do a lot of things differently. So a mature team may find that sprints are too slow for them. They won't like sprints. They may think that, well, if we have to have a sprint review all the time, well, that's half an hour or an hour every week or every at the end of every sprint, which is wasted. They won't want all of these meetings. They will want to rapidly deploy. A mature team will be thinking, why do I want to wait until the end of the sprint to deploy this? I've done the work today. It's been tested today. I want to deploy it today. And a mature team will be more than happy to deploy to production multiple times per day. And that's fantastic, because it means that you're actually, like the deployment release cycle is actually another bottleneck. So if you have to wait for everything to be backed up for the end of the sprint, then you have to have a more rigorous testing phase for that sprint. If you can just get that out the same day that you deploy, that you develop, then you're reducing those bottlenecks. A mature team will prefer communication over planning. So that sounds a bit weird, but what they end up doing is planning on the fly. So they'll understand the problems and understand the potential issues that may arise, but they won't spend hours trying to preempt them and trying to architect necessarily. They'll have a bit of communication, and they'll swarm together and start actually working on the problem rather than trying to draw everything out. And yeah, as I said, they'll swarm together and to fix the problems rather than having to go through planning sessions and retrospectives. So this is very close to what Kanban is like. I'm not sure if how many people are familiar with Kanban practices, but In Kanban, we focus more about the flow of the work rather than the people. There is a practice of limiting the amount of work that you do. So picture a bridge that's incomplete. So if you have a team that's working on many bridges, none of them deliver any value until they're complete. So there is a focus of limiting the amount of work so you can finish a bridge and then you move on to the next one. And this is all about managing flow. And in Kanban, processes are explicit, so there's nothing left up to guessing in Kanban, and there are built-in feedback loops as well. And the whole idea is a mature team will collaborate, and they will evolve their processes over time and collaborate in a way that is really fast. So I've talked about bottlenecks, team configuration, the way your services are, challenges, and project management methodologies. Now I want to talk about agencies, because I have an agency background. So when you have inter and intra-team dependencies, varied project types, and support agreements, and on top of that, you have emergencies that pop up out of nowhere, it really does feel like the house is on fire and the extinguisher is also on fire. So how do you deal with agency structures? So instead of moving people around, you need to ring fence them into teams that allow them to succeed. So in this case, here's a build team. There's a Scrum Master, a UI, UX people, front-end developer, back-end, and QA. So that all makes sense. It's a pretty simple team. You can have multiple of those. These are just the skill sets that you need. You can't get by without any of these skill sets. The support and maintenance team, I've called it Team Chaos here because that's what the team was called in my previous company. It was really the team that would be the saviors of the whole department, because all the chaos was ring fenced into this one team. All the emergencies, all the random requests, so the random consultancy, the pitch work. This was the team that allowed the other teams to succeed. There's also this notion of a design team. So the design team doesn't do any development. There's literally only designers and a project manager. This was because of the nature of the work that came through. We had all different types of work, all different streams. The company was print and digital and had brand and campaigns. And there's this notion of having a skill pool. So instead of shuffling people from the build team over to support team, et cetera, you would have this notion of a skill pool where these people would be absorbed into the other teams as required. So typically that would be in the support and maintenance team, but then that would move over to the build teams as required. When it comes to project management methodologies, the build teams were using Scrum. The design teams were doing Waterfall because the design projects were very, very heavily prescriptive and were basically Waterfall projects. So there was no avoiding that, really. The support maintenance was running a Kanban process because think of it as support tickets that come through on a help desk. They just churn through those bits of work one at a time. So in summary, I've talked about bottlenecks in your organization and how your team configuration can actually cause bottlenecks and how the different service types in an organization can affect each other. Maturity of teams and project management methodologies. So not every team can do Kanban. Not every team can do Scrum straight away. And if you're stuck in Waterfall, there are ways that you can introduce agile practices into the Waterfall projects. And then I've talked about how you can ring fence teams to allow you to actually succeed with the other teams. So in the case of what I just showed you, Team Chaos was the team that absorbed all the chaos in the department so that the other teams can succeed. And that's me. Thank you. You're on mute, Matt.
Sorry, there we go. Yeah, thanks for that. Great talk. I think there was a few questions popped up in the chat as you were talking. I don't know if you were looking at them as you go, but it looks like Livia has a few questions he wants to ask, so it might be worth him just unmuting and firing away.
Yep.
If you can hear me, Livia, I believe you can unmute yourself.
Hello?
Yes, hi, Livia.
All right. Yeah, I'm sorry about that. I used the group chat as a note-taking system of sorts, and I was hoping someone would digest them and see, what fits the purpose or not. So I'm going through them. We talked a little bit about the seniority and how that overlaps with the teams. I think there was a mention at some point that potentially a team of experts, or as the expression went, a team full of experts is suboptimal. And to some extent, we faced sometimes similar issues with people who just wouldn't go along and have, diverging opinions, both of them being valid maybe. But I was wondering if a Scrum team, since the expectation is for them to be able to, estimate in terms of complexity and not really towards a very particular developer in the team. So that perhaps makes some assumptions regarding the level of seniority within the team to be aligned. And if you do need a team of experts, you still have to make it work. And the question, and I think that we went on a little bit of a debate here, we figured perhaps that's a cultural problem rather than anything else. So what's your take on that?
Yeah, there's a lot of different issues there. So definitely there's cultural issues, and not just nationality cultures. That can definitely feed into.
Oh no, I'm not referring to nationality.
Also,
I'm just referring to very,
team cultures. Yeah.
Company culture, organization, nothing else.
Yeah, so a team and company cultures. So if your team isn't communicating enough, then you will get you will get a bit of siloed knowledge. You will get developers that do think, oh, well, if I put my head down and don't talk to anyone, then I'll get the most work done. But then you get suboptimal results because they may.
How did you deal with that?
Sorry.
How did you deal with that? How did you stop that practice?
So I'm kind of dealing with that right now in my new company. So getting people to communicate more often is the most important thing. So getting them to communicate daily, not just in a stand-up. So the stand-up is really an unblocking session. But if they're not communicating at other points in the day, then that's a bigger problem. So having something like a dev channel in Microsoft Teams or Slack, and encouraging people to ask questions daily, multiple times per day, gets the communication going. And as part of that, having small pull requests as a policy. Your pull request can't be above a certain size, for instance, and tagging multiple people on the pull request, so that so then you spread the knowledge around the team about the type of code that you're writing.
Yep, thanks. Should I go on with these other questions or dive into this one? I'm not sure. We noticed you mentioned at some point something about changing behaviors and practices, and the question was whether you had any metrics around that to measure whether the change was good or bad. I understand you flipped it and you reversed it, which you said, but did you have any measures in place?
Unfortunately, no, we didn't have any. We didn't do any metrics. If I had the time again, I would have outlined some very specific problems. So the main problem was we had developers that were being booked to do maintenance work, and then you would rebook them to do project work, and they would context switch between different streams of work, different types of work. And I'm sure we all know that this is super inefficient, but in agencies, this is how they work. Agencies come from a time when you could book a designer to do a poster, and then the designer can do a magazine the next day. So what I would have done is I would have took some sort of velocity metric on the projects to see how long they take, and then shown the same result, well, not the same result, but shown a better result if you isolate the people in a project and never context switch them out.
Yeah, makes sense. Thank you.
Yeah, another metric would have been quality, so number of bugs, because when you switch people in and out of projects, in and out of maintenance work, the number of bugs that end up being introduced over time.
Yeah, spaghetti code as well. So you mentioned that people have a tendency to maybe hate Waterfall, and I completely get it. Sometimes I would agree as well, but perhaps this is a good forum to ask, and I'm genuinely interested in the response and understand why would typically people have a tendency to hate Waterfall. I don't know, top 3, conditions, if you will. Just imagining whether you would really like to, fly a plane whose software has been developed in an agile way with a fail fast, fail often approach, or you want to be more like Waterfall/RUP or something. So why would typically people just hate Waterfall? I look at it as an instrument, and I don't really hate the hammer. I just choose the instrument. So why do you feel like people would hate Waterfall?
For me personally, Waterfall is something that's, well, for one thing, it's not used properly. Yeah, I've never seen a Waterfall project used properly. It tends to be very heavy upfront, and you try to define absolutely everything that could possibly be part of the project. I give the example of when you do renovations of a house. Do you choose every single fixture, the color of the screws, everything before the house is built? Typically, no. I mean, if you do, that's great, but you may walk into the house once it's built and say, I really wish I didn't choose that colored doorknob. I think a brass doorknob would be better than a chrome one. But during the process of doing a renovation, you visit the house very often to make sure that everything is going well, and you make decisions about the next bit of work. It's not so prescriptive up front. You make those decisions along the way. Yes, you have to make the bigger decisions up front, or maybe not, but depends on what you're trying to do. But a lot of the finer details emerge during the process. So that's the problem with Waterfall. People trying to do all of that upfront stuff, and then they tie the budget to the documentation, and they tie the timeline to the documentation, and then nothing is allowed to move. But then you may have people that say, well, that's okay. We know that things will change, so we'll have a bug fixing sprint, or hardening sprints, or a bug fixing phase. But the thing is, it shouldn't have had bugs to begin with. You should have done automated testing from the very beginning. You should have taken the requirements, built up some sort of automated test, and then written the code to satisfy the test. You can't do the testing at the end. It doesn't make any sense. So that's my problem with Waterfall. People that think you can do everything in phases, which doesn't. Yeah.
So I'll just take another one more question from you. I see there's more messages there, and I'm sorry, I'm hijacking this. But you mentioned there's the notion of mature team. going maybe more towards Kanban, in the sense that they want to deploy, deliver, as soon as they're done, and not have to waste the half hour on retrospective or maybe on sprint reviews or whatnot. So maybe that's valid, but how does it scale? So if you're looking at the mature team being more dynamic and chaotic, self-organized in the sense that they don't even follow the Scrum ceremonies, or they just take one item at a time and fix it. Now, in the sense of a program with multiple projects, when I try to become a bit more predictable, and I don't really have an influence on how they estimate, so I just take note of what they estimate, right? I wonder how that can be kept predictable and in sync between multiple projects.
So it depends on the scenario. So if you're running a pull-based Kanban workflow, then you would have metrics on your velocity. So we can deliver X number of work items, and this is our cycle time, and this is our lead time. So you know what the team can produce. In terms of different products, well,
I'm looking at projects that have the interdependencies between them.
Okay, well that's very different. So you would need different teams, obviously. That's a hard one. So if you had something like Spotify, which has, yes, it looks like one application to the end user, but you actually have different products in between that make up the Spotify application, you would need to have check-in points for all the integration. So in scaled Scrum, you have this notion of a Nexus team, and the Nexus team is an integration kind of. It's not necessarily the people that do the integration, but it's representatives from every team, every Scrum team that is in this committee, and daily they will meet and talk about the interdependencies between the different teams. So the teams themselves can be running a Kanban process, but the process of daily unblocking of those interdependencies is what the Nexus team does in scaled Scrum. I'm not sure if I've explained that well enough.
Thank you very much, sir. That's all from me. Thank you.
So we've got a question from Nick Dyer now. Let me just unmute. There you go.
Thanks. Thanks, Anthony. Really enjoyed the presentation. It's my first time with the CTO meetup group, and this has been really timely for me. I have one of my clients is about to go live on a new product in the next 4 or 5 weeks, and I had a discussion with the project sponsor this week about how the team are going to handle support, because they haven't got a support team in place. So I like the idea that you've highlighted there about sort of ring fencing the chaos. And I guess I have a question about, the name of the team sort of implies the conditions of the work, right? Team chaos. And I think the thing that comes to my head is people are not going to want to be on that team for very long. It's obviously a necessity. I'm just questioning, how do you manage, I guess, morale when you know people have got to be working on a team that does the dirty work, as it were? Yeah,
that's a common problem all over the world. No one wants to do maintenance. You have to cycle people in and out of the team, obviously. How often you do that is really dependent on how painful the work is, and also the temperament of the people. So you will have developers that just hate it, and they'll be very vocal about it. And you will have people that don't mind it. There needs to be some sort of consensus about the fairness of how often this happens. So you can't just say blanket 2 months for everyone, take it or leave it, because that ends up potentially ending up with a little bit of resentment, or maybe not. So it depends on the team, and it totally depends on the type of work. So for me, I would gather the team and say to them, hey, we're going to do this on a 2-monthly cycle at first, and we'll see how it goes. If people are really hating it, then this is something that we need to discuss, and you can come off it if you're really, really hating it. But as a team, we need to figure out what's fair for everyone and not just for individual people. So there's totally give and take. It has to be flexible.
Appreciate that. Thanks very much.
I think we've got a question from Matt Saunders now.
Hey Matt, thank you. Thanks, Anthony. Great talk. Yeah, a bit of a follow-on from what Nick was talking about. It's great that you've got a chaos team to sort out all the chaos, and obviously he's covered cycling people in and out of it. Do you think I get the impression there's a bit of a problem if you create a chaos team, and that then implies that the chaos is there forever. Do you have a process for kind of getting some of the repeated bits of chaos sorted out for good? Does that sort of stuff ever go back into the dev team so that even if you always need a chaos team, they're dealing with like different chaos as time goes by?
Yeah, well, the reason we called it Team Chaos was because, yeah, it was chaos. The reasons the chaos typically occur is because of the really high priority emergencies. So a website goes down, well, you need to jump on this. You can't just schedule this for next week. As time goes by, code bases get better, things get more stable, so hopefully the emergencies don't occur as often. We also had a Kanban flow, so a lot of the problem with large organizations that have external people wanting support is they tend to want their issue to be dealt with first. So classic example, a PM would contact a developer directly and say, hey, I need you to do this. And if you don't have the processes in place where you basically tell the developer you have to say no because like they need to go through the proper channels, then you're going to have chaos. I did say to one developer though that you know what the process is now, but if you choose to do something for an external PM and it's really quick, then it's totally up to you. I'm not going to say don't do it, but you need something in return. Whether it's a donut or a chocolate or something, it can't just be free work for everyone. And there needs to be some sort of order to it. Otherwise, everyone just contacts individual developers all the time.
Pragmatic chaos with donuts sounds ideal to me. I like the sound of that. Good, thank you.
Yeah, but over time, things did get a lot smoother, and the external PMs did go through the right channels. And people tend to be less demanding if they know that there's a queue and they can see the queue.
Perfect. Any more questions from anyone else? I think that might be it. Yeah, thank you very much, Anthony. Anthony, great talk. Good questions at the end. And yeah, we'll see you all next time. Thank you very much.